So hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sofia and I'm from Agile 42. Some of you maybe heard already that I'm located in Helsinki, and I'm really happy to be here with my Agile 42 colleague Michèle and also with our very good friend Sonja. They are going to talk today about the human factors in Agile transformations. It's going to be very interesting, at least for me, to sit here and listen to you and maybe take part of the discussion. So I'm really looking forward to this. To all of you who are in the live session today, please set your chat settings to panelists and attendees so that you can talk with us in the chat throughout the session. And for any questions that you have to Michèle or Sonja throughout the webinar, you can put them in the Q&A and we're going to monitor your questions also throughout the webinar. There's going to be a recording of the webinar, and this recording is going to be shared on social media with you later, I think next week. So I'm going to put some links also for you in the chat that might be helpful, so keep an eye on that. That's it from my side. I'm going to hand it over to you, Michèle and Sonja. You can maybe introduce yourselves a little bit more than I just did and kick off the session.
Cool. Shall I go first, Michèle? Sonja Blignaut. You can hear the South African pronunciation. So I am based in Pretoria in South Africa. And yeah, I've been working in the field of complexity and all the various applications of it now for about two decades. So I am very interested in particular in how human beings respond to change and to uncertainty and to complexity. So I am really looking forward to this conversation. And it's all girls, you know, last time it was all men, so we're bringing some balance. So yeah, over to you, Michèle.
Exciting, yes. So also here, very excited to be in this webinar with Sonja. And I'm a coach at Agile 42, very interested in systems. My background is in public health and been working in organizations now, and my interest is really how people connect, relate, collaborate. And whenever there's things I'm struggling to understand, I go to Sonja's blog and I start reading and I get inspired. So yes, I'm excited about this topic, and indeed we have everyone to contribute. We're all humans and very much familiar with the human factors in the workplace, and that's what we have as our topic today. So just thinking about, you know, the current times and what we are facing right now with changes in workspace and many changes externally, how we are sort of interested in this question of how, to what extent are we actually valuing humans and interactions above sort of the digital processes and electronic communication tools, and how are we paying attention to that in the current times? So that's been sort of the theme and the conversations, and of course all the things that are tied into that. So any thoughts that you have on that, Sonja?
You know, it's really interesting, Michèle. You know, I was listening to the previous webinar as well, where Dave and Martin spoke, and they also touched on this a little bit. But in my experience, I don't think we're paying enough attention to the humans in these processes, and when we do, you know, it's quite superficial, and it's almost like we're treating the humans the same way that we're treating the machines. You know, this whole idea of digital transformation, I tend to agree a bit with what Dave said last time, that it feels a bit like a fad. But normally how it plays out in I don't know what it looks like in the clients that you work with, is it just, it essentially plays out as almost like a tsunami of change. And the focus is much more on the processes and the systems. And then we've got change management kind of tagged on. And I normally get myself in trouble because I think change management is a bit of an oxymoron. So I don't think that we're really prioritizing people. I don't know what your sense is. I'm sure, you know, in your role as Agile coach, you've got many stories to share of what you're seeing.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And I just had an experience recently with a client where, we were kind of working together with lead coaches in a company and really thinking about what are the current needs of the team members and how to do that in this current space and with the situation that we're all facing. Because what clearly came out as a need was that we need to get together in a room, we need to see each other, we need to be able to just hug each other and greet each other and be in contact. And so thinking about really how to do that in this space, it's challenging. It's not an easy thing to do. And basically, we were sort of looking at various formats, and even that, it doesn't feel like it's getting to that core human warmth that you look for in sort of a workshop. And eventually we worked together with the participants and looked at the needs and tried to create something. And it ended up being sort of helpful in the sense that we had 3 days. The first day was challenging, just thinking about process, and then it started going into deeper conversations, and it started becoming more really palpable that there was a sense of connection in the room. And so, yeah, it's interesting to kind of observe that and see what was it that contributed to that and allowed that to happen. And I suppose for me, it was because these people knew each other, they had been in touch with each other before, and were trying to also get together physically, where there was a sense of trust that already was there. So I think that helped a lot. Whereas people coming in for the first time, not knowing sort of the various participants and possibly also even the culture and how we do things around here, it was more of a feeling of needing to build that trust. And that in a digital space is also not easy. So, yeah.
And I think tagging on to what you're saying about trust, something that I'm noticing in many organizations, I've actually been surprised by the depth that you can get to in a virtual setting, especially even with people who don't necessarily know each other. I've been quite surprised. I think some of it also rests in terms of how the quality of facilitation, etc. But something that I'm seeing is, and linking to the kind of broader idea of digital and tools and how we are using technology, something that I'm seeing is almost as if all of these tools that we're using and the technology that we're deploying, a bit of a risk in this is it feels like there's a bit of a dark side to it. I've had several clients here, and I've noticed some reports in magazines and some of the virtual trades around surveillance and how tools are being used to surveil people. And I find it really interesting because, there's this, I think it comes from a little bit from managers and they need to control, which obviously is a bit of a systemic issue because, the other thing that I've also seen in organizations is with all of this change, none of the performance expectations have really been adapted. So people are expected to perform at the same levels. They're expected to be as productive or even more so as they used to be. And if they're not, it's almost like we then deploy technology against them. And I find that this is eroding trust, not only in teams, but almost in whether or not people trust the companies that they work for. So I think there's this trust idea, it's on multiple levels. There's, how do you foster this in a virtual or a distributed environment? But then I think, from a larger digital transformation perspective, I think people are almost starting to distrust not only the technology, but also the company. And I think that in the longer term can have, pretty significant consequences.
Completely agree. Yeah. So I was thinking about the comments that Dave, Martin, and Peter were making in the previous webinar around digital transformations and how to explore hybrid forms, how to look at ways in which we could not just be fixed on one particular tool, and look at the context and look at what the needs are, and where there's, you know, a need for a particular psychological safety and trust to look at other ways in which to create that. And I think that where possible, these have been introduced, but I think that most companies are not willing to kind of look at various ways and means to get that kind of interaction that is sometimes needed.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's fascinating. You're talking about psychological safety. You're reminding me of a recent client engagement. One of the impacts that I'm observing of technology in general, you know, so I'm not going to make this about digital transformation per se, but it feels like the way that we are connected now, our access to technology, and the way that we are using that technology is dissolving people's boundaries. Their, you know, we want to call it work-life boundaries, identity boundaries, whatever you want to call this. So people are just expected to always be online. They, you know, whereas in the past, you know, we had the boundaries of the daily commute, for example, those routines, the rituals. You could sit in your daily commute and listen to a podcast or read a book or whatever. Now there's almost this assumption that because you're not commuting, that time is fair game for meetings. And it's fascinating. In one of my clients recently, we had a workshop, and it started off by this executive team kind of articulating that they are concerned about their workers. They're concerned about their people. They're not sure how to balance productivity with well-being. They themselves are on the verge of burnout, you know, so there was this whole conversation going on. And then the moment it started getting practical in terms of, so what can you do to create an environment where people can, you know, have some balance, have some coherence. You know, I mentioned in the pre-recording, you know, this Antonovsky's sense of coherence framework. What is the responsibility of the organization? And we started talking about really practical things, you know, like setting up your email system, for example, not to allow back-to-back meetings. Or I would think it's a bit of a no-brainer, but kind of putting a policy in place that says people are allowed to take leave and not work while they are on leave. And immediately the atmosphere in the room changed, you know, and I still remember this executive basically said, you know, we are not the saviors on white horses. People are responsible to manage their own boundaries. And I found it really interesting because we've got this technological space where, you know, it's like we're just always on. And it feels like organizations are really making use of that. You know, I think it to an extent, it suits them to have people, you know, online all the time. And I don't think that's sustainable.
Wow, that's interesting. That as soon as it got practical, there was sort of the sense of it's their personal responsibility. Because, yeah, I'm also sensing that, you know, people care. People actually want to be doing as much work as they can, and oftentimes it is more than they should be. And we don't have this commute anymore. And often it happens that you've got calls back to back, and it just happens because we had this sudden shift, right? And I think it's so interesting that you've had these conversations with some clients. We certainly have also had it in our team and in our organization, and it's not a given, right? It's not just sort of something that someone's going to say, excuse me, I need 15 minutes just to go for a bio break and maybe just smell the roses briefly. But I guess it is both, right? It's a personal responsibility aspect, but also how do we in our organization create an environment or necessary constraints and situations that are also enabling a space for productivity, trust, psychological safety. And it's kind of both, and finding a balance between those, because it definitely is something where there's not enough of a conversation happening, I believe.
Mm. And there are some really toxic things creeping in. You know, even before the pandemic, you know, one of the clients I was working with, and this was in the context of a digital transformation, the amount of change that gets pushed into a system, you know, it's just, you know, it boggles the mind, you know, and when you kind of follow it upstream, and you work with the executive teams, you know, they would say, but we only have, you know, like 1 or 2 prioritized projects in each of our areas. But then you look at this, you know, this is typically it's an executive team of a particular area. So 1 or 2 prioritized projects in each of our areas kind of comes to sometimes, you know, between 13 and 20 projects. That then all of that change gets pushed down into the organization, you know, and it's nobody wants to sacrifice or not prioritize their big project. And in the end, it's this, it really is like a tsunami of change that kind of filters through to the lower, you know, to the downstream, if you want to call it that. You know, so at that stage, you know, I was saying to them, you know, the same way you put in place WIP limits, you need to put in change in progress limits, and you need to really think about how do you stagger this? Because, you know, the metaphor we ended up using was, you know, it's like a dam with sluices. And if you don't think carefully about how much water you let out, you flood the downstream. You know, so that was already going on. And now we've got the pandemic and sudden remote working and all of this on top of that. And even before then, this particular area where I was working, there were all kinds of conversations going on around who would be impacted when this, you know, digital transformation process kind of, you know, would come to an end. And many people were essentially already working themselves out of a job because they were, you know, looking at automation and all kinds of things. And now, so that fear is already in the system. So we're talking about safety here. You know, it's so people already have I think a distrust. They feel very precarious in terms of what's going to happen to my job when this process, you know, concludes. And now we've got the pandemic and remote working on top of this. And what I'm starting to see now in some of my clients, it's almost a form of survivor guilt. You know, so they would complain on the one hand and say, you know, I've got no balance. I'm always working. It's impacting on my family. It's impacting on my health, but at least I still have a job. And then if the organization is not coming to the party and helping to put some of these boundaries in place, I don't think people actually feel safe to assert some boundaries. I think that's why we're seeing so many resignations. People just can't cope anymore.
And then, of course,
there is a good question that we might maybe take in the middle here, because it maybe links a little bit to what you guys are talking about. But there's one question from a person saying that he actually misses also to work and misses the interactions with humans at work. But some people and some companies maybe don't want to go back to working also in the offices. They want to stay remote. So is there a risk also with this and with these conversations going that you might not go back to the office someday?
I think there's a potential that lies in that, not going back to the office. Because certainly I've also seen companies that have seen this as an opportunity to interact differently in different spaces that are inspiring spaces. Some offices are very inspiring, but some are not. And let's face it, I mean, there's a very specific way of being in an office, and there are patterns and behaviors that come out of that kind of organization space or company space. And this has also been an opportunity to think about how can we create those spaces for human interaction in a way that's going to serve us and possibly even create something that we've never had before. So to use the remote situation to really have those conversations that are needed for work, but also have those boundaries in place and say, okay, we are going to connect with the necessary precautions around COVID in a space that's inspiring, and be creative and innovative and think what is wanting to emerge in our company, and how can we use the space to also start maybe introducing a different way of being. So I think there is potential, but of course it's not something that everyone has had a chance to explore yet, because it is kind of overwhelming just to deal with what's currently happening. I don't know what your thoughts are, Sonja.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm currently in the middle of writing almost like an academic article for a conference on sense of belonging in this new kind of virtual space and the various impacts. And I completely agree with you. It's I think that the time of, people coming to the office, going and sitting in an open space office with a little cubicle and doing individual work, I think that is over. I think people have realized I can be much more productive doing that somewhere else. So the office, I think, is going to become a place where people come together to connect, to do the creative work, to collaborate, not the kind of office environments that we're used to right now. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out post-COVID, when people can come together again. But I think one of the interesting things that came up in our research is we tend to think about the importance of people coming to the office for connection and for collaboration. But I think one of the other things that's really important is it's a place for people to get out of their bubbles and encounter diversity. I think we underestimate, the importance of running into people and working with people in the same space who are different from us. And now we tend to, I've had moments myself where I can very happily just sit in my own home for a week and not see anybody. And all you're really, interacting with is things like social media and other people. So I think that tension between belonging and diversity is really important. And that is something that is linked to place and being in the same place. So it is going to be very interesting. And people don't feel the same. I think this is the other thing. We've done some narrative inquiries. Some people say, I can't wait to go back to the office. And other people say, if you force me to go back, I'm leaving. I never, ever want to go back. So there's this very different perspectives out there.
Absolutely. And I think the one thing is also sort of just socially connecting and having those opportunities to have coffee together, network, explore kind of ideas and things. But then there's also the opportunities to get together very intentionally to try and see how can we sort of feel and think ourselves into our new way of being. And potentially that might mean new offerings, new products, new services, and to very intentionally design those spaces. And I think that's exciting. And that's where a few companies are going. And certainly I see the employees being excited about it, because as you said, sort of the things that we can do individually in front of the screen is much more effective to just do that at home. But where I need to bounce my ideas off someone that's very different in terms of their background, context, and thinking is what I need. I need to be able to get that feedback and to see, see their body language and experience them in person. And it's exciting to think about how that's going to develop in the future now.
Yeah, and it links a little bit. So Nigel just put a comment in the chat. And so he's asking if we think that there are industries that's going to cease to exist because they enable social behavior, and what the impact will be on social skills. I don't think that we've even started to see the impact that this is going to have. I think, for example, of babies born now who they only really, except for their parents, they only have interaction with people wearing masks. What is the impact of that going to be? So the impact on young people, but then even, I find myself, in the beginning, I was really missing social interaction, and now I've almost gotten used to it, to not having it. And I don't know if this is permanent. If I think about going and sitting in a crowded restaurant now, or going to a music concert with thousands of people, I almost have an anxiety response. And even when COVID is over, COVID just emerged from nowhere. We don't know when the next one is coming. So I think that I from a mental health perspective, and from how our habits and our social interactions have been impacted by this, I don't think we've even started to see the tip of the iceberg of that. And I do think it's going to flow through to industries. I mean, we're already seeing it in South Africa, our restaurant industry, it's really struggling. Musicians, comedians, all of these kind of people who needed that physical interaction. So I don't think it's a weak signal, Nigel. I think it's a pretty strong trend. I don't know what you think, Michèle. You're in Cape Town, so maybe Cape Townians are a bit different than us here in Gauteng.
No, I think it's what's so interesting is that, viruses have always been around. And now that something is becoming so explicit and spoken about, I feel that a lot of behavior is very fear-driven as well. And it kind of limits us, and it's a pity. However, the opportunities, I do think, are also huge when it comes to remote work, but I think it's to really intentionally think about how we use it, and to think about what is healthy for each of us, and that only we can know. And that, I think, is worth exploring more, and to really think about also, what used to be an 8-hour day maybe is no longer an 8-hour day, but rather a 4-hour day. If you've read the 4-Hour Work Week, then now's the time. Let's automate what needs to be automated, and let's start thinking about where that human magic can really become valuable, even if it is using digital tools. But I think to look at doing it intentionally. Yeah.
So I see Lothar has a question in the Q&A. So he said, in our experience, what do we think helps some people to handle digital transformation or digitalization better than others? I don't know if you have a perspective on that, Michèle.
So I think it's a matter of perception. And again, I think it's about creating spaces for different experiences around digitization and digital processes, and for that to be intentional. So I suppose taking time to really make sure that everyone in the room, for example, is familiar with the particular tool that's being used, or potentially the digital process that's being introduced, but then to really explore and see what the needs are around that. Of course, we all have organizations and companies with different sort of generations, which is, again, diversity that adds value, I think. And to look into that and see how can we use that diversity intentionally and deliberately. Not everyone may need to be completely immersed in the digital process or the digitization, if you can accommodate for something else. So to look at the alternatives and other options that are available. But of course, sometimes it's kind of a situation where you lose people. I mean, I'm in South Africa, and digitization is exclusive. It really is. There are many, many people that just cannot access, right? So you're making an entire workflow potentially only accessible to some people. And that's where we are at right now. Hopefully that will change. And I do believe that it will change and that we can use it in a way that will serve us.
Mm. And I think there's definitely a bit of a dark side to this, especially in some contexts. I've heard here in South Africa in particular, because we've got so much instability in the workforce, people actually articulate that they want to get rid of the humans. So and we've already got a 70% plus, youth unemployment rate. So it's not, I think, we must also be careful to not kind of paint digitalization as something that's always positive. But I think, Lothar, coming back to your question, it's interesting. I think there are so many, just if you look at the language we use when we talk about change, so if we take the digitalization and we just look at because it involves change. It involves us adopting new tools, adopting new ways of working. And I think we've almost been habituated into seeing change as something that is done to us, that happens from the outside. It's something that we can resist. It's all of these interesting terms that people use from a change management perspective. But if you think about it, change is just life. If you take a flow perspective, and now I need to be careful with Nigel on the call, but our lives are flows through time and space. Change is life. When change stops, then life stops. So I think there's an aspect to this in terms of how people think about change. So that's the one side of it. I think some people are more open to it than others. But then this is where I've really found that sense of coherence framework by Antonovsky to be very, very useful, because he talks about, I don't know if for those of you who haven't read or listened to the pre-recording, he talks about sense of coherence as an individual sense that your life and your context, your inner and outer reality, makes sense. And there are three aspects to it. So the first is comprehensibility. So can I understand what is going on? And in a complex context, this almost plays out as can I make sense even in the midst of the uncertainty? Can I make sense? Can I make decisions? The second is manageability, or can I cope? Do I feel that I've got the inner resources, the outer resources, and maybe the network or the community, the social resources to be able to cope with what is happening, to cope with a change? And then the third one is meaningfulness. Can I motivate myself? Does it feel meaningful to engage? Can I find meaning? And I think those three things, when they are present, people are much better able to cope with change, whether it's digital transformation or any other. And I do believe that there's and again, I think, Michèle, we spoke about this earlier, there's an individual or a personal responsibility around this, but then there's an organizational responsibility. And it links to what you just said. Do people understand what the change is and how to use the tools and what the impact will be on them? Have they been given the resources to cope? Do they feel they've got the right skills? And you spoke about the inequalities. I think sometimes we assume that people know what they need to know, and they just don't. They don't have the resources to cope with this, and then in the end we sit with a pervasive loss of meaning. I think of how many people are not necessarily knowledge workers. They are people who work on the front line. They're people who potentially will be replaced. What happens to them at the end of these processes? How do we provide meaningful activity for them? What does meaning look like in a digitized economy? I think that is a really, really interesting question to explore.
So I'm seeing Trevor's question here. Don't you think that you are focusing on the negative aspects too much? Maybe there are many positives too. And are we not trying to be more agile? So I do believe there are many, many aspects. And I think that both Sonja and I were thinking about, the value of being able to also look at, well, yes, we want to be more agile. And one of the manifesto value statements is people and interactions above processes and tools. And nowadays we are finding, my experience is that the focus is often on those processes, those digital processes and those electronic communication tools. You know, what tools are we using? Is it Microsoft Teams? Is it Zoom? Is it this? Is it that? And I do believe, however, that there are many, many opportunities in this. So it is to explore those as well and to see how we basically are just aware of what's currently happening. Because with the current speed of how things are shifting and changing, I think there is also a possibility that it might sort of just slip and not be noticed. So I think the conversation is also just about the noticing. And that I guess it's a matter of perception, whether it's you know, a negative thing or a positive thing. And I certainly do feel that there are many benefits that can be experienced through this, as I said, as long as it's intentional. And what I am experiencing as well is that even though everyone connects on a tool, sometimes there's still sort of just the patterns that tend to happen, the roles, the scripts, you know, and to kind of be aware of it and see how can we get into the screen and somehow make it more real, because it doesn't always feel that real. And it's easy to kind of zone out, and it's easy to multitask and context switch all the time. So and maybe I'm just speaking for myself. Maybe it's not an issue for anyone else, but I do think that it's something that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think it's the same as complexity. It's not really good or bad. It just is. And I think it's playing out. It's good for some and not necessarily for others. And I think what maybe why there's a bit of a focus on the negative at the moment is the and we're talking about the human impact, is our current context. You know, this conversation is happening in the middle of a pandemic where people, I mean, their resources are really, really tapped. You know, I look at the people that I'm working with, they're struggling, you know, and in that sense, to tell somebody to be more agile or, you know, introduce even more change, you know, it's a completely different context than what we were in 18 months ago. But for some, it's I mean, for me, it's been positive, you know, and many of my friends, you know, people who are in that knowledge economy. And now you can essentially work anywhere in the world. You're not bound to a geography anymore. You know, I can connect with interesting people from all over the world. You know, I can arrange like an international conference here in South Africa and not have to fly anybody in. You know, so there are many opportunities that didn't exist before. I guess my biggest fear at the moment, or not really a fear, but my worry is that we're not going to use this crisis as a catalyst for real and, you know, real transformation, real change. And that we just, because, you know, what I'm hearing in most organizations is, when are we going back to normal? Or what is the next normal? I see we've now moved from new normal to next normal. That's now the way that we're talking about this. But there's this longing to go back to some kind of normality. And I really hope that that doesn't pull us back to just how things, you know, like a hybrid way of how things used to be, and that we make use of this opportunity for real change.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments that we can?
Now is a really good chance to ask any questions. There are no open questions at the moment, but if you are still wondering about anything, you have the chance now to ask Sonja and Michèle. There is one now. Given a new team who can only work remotely, what would you suggest to build the trust within that team remotely?
I would suggest sharing human stories as a starting point and to connect, if it's a remote team, in that way, before kind of going any deeper. Sonja, you were going to say something.
No, I wanted to say this is probably more in your wheelhouse than mine. You're yeah, I agree. I think we underestimate. I've been partnering with someone here in South Africa who works with mindfulness practices. And I think we underestimate, simple things. Sometimes I love the word that you've been using, Michèle, around being intentional with things. I think sometimes, for example, when we do things like a check-in, or, we kind of just rush through it, it becomes like a habitual thing, and we're not really intentional about it. And I think if we're more mindful about those things, and we bring in the human stories, just share as human beings, I think that can go a long way. Something that we implemented, we weren't a new team, but we've only really seen each other once or twice because we're spread out all over the world. But we started doing, every week we have like a coffee check-in. And there was only one rule, and that's here we don't talk about work at all. And it was just an opportunity for us to connect as human beings. And so I think it's about not just jumping into the work, but making sure that people are able to connect as people whenever they come together. I guess that's the most important.
Yeah.
We've had that also with some friends, but the risk is that there is already some kind of Zoom fatigue behind also being socially active with your friends online or family after working hours or whatever. So it's really nice when it works, but sometimes you just don't want to also spend then another half an hour or an hour behind the screen even if it's with friends, which is weird for social people or very outgoing people, but yeah.
Yeah, and I was just thinking, one of the other things to build trust is to sort of pair and have trios and start working together on something. The trust that is kind of established in creating something together or trying to achieve a goal together is really powerful. And it's at times that's where you start feeling a bit of friction, and you sort of like have different opinions and you start disagreeing with each other, and that's the potential to actually build trust. So that's always a great sign when that starts coming into the space. It's not just all false harmony of everyone's happy and saying that's a great idea, let's do that, but rather sort of challenging each other and seeing how can we jiggle and poke each other and try and get to a better solution or a better result. And that's when you really start getting to know each other and also start showing potential vulnerabilities around what feels uncomfortable or may be difficult to do because it may be outside of one's comfort zone. And so I think that's really important. And with a team that's working entirely remotely, if there is some form of external facilitation to start out with, that's always very helpful and can really support that process to sort of establish yourself as a team, as an identity, and looking at how you want to be with each other, how you want to be in the space together with each other, and really draw out those values that are important to each and every team member. So those are a few things that I would focus on, and I think there are many more things that one could do. But I think connecting on a human level is to me also the first sort of entry point and really important aspect.
And maybe just to build on what you were saying, Michèle, it's some of the things that just kind of happens naturally when you're working together in one office. We now need to be very intentional about recreating, and even things like being quite explicit about creating that container and how are we going to have difficult conversations, and our role, are the role boundaries in these things clear, and what do we do when they're not? Because you're not in the room together, you can't read the body language anymore. So how do you, I think something else that could be quite useful here is, how do we create new rituals? How do we ritualize things to make sure that they happen when they can no longer kind of just unfold naturally? So new routines, new rituals. I think those are some of the things to experiment with.
I like that. Yes, definitely. I mean, also because we lose a lot of the information that we usually have in a physical space, whether it's, the olfactory information or the auditory information, if there's background sounds and there's distortion, or some people don't like the camera on, or they don't have good connectivity, so they switch the camera off. So you don't really have such a comprehensive sense of kind of that interaction or the engagement. And so that means we need to find ways to be more clear in our way of communicating, and more explicit about also how we are sort of feeling or what we are perceiving, I think, and to really always, and this is something that we at Agile 42 are also always aware of, is to always assume positive intent and really focus on an attitude of curiosity and looking to see, have I understood you correctly? And for some reason, I'm not sure about what I've understood because I can't see you. Your screen is off. So I need to just confirm if I've heard you properly. And, so focusing on the listening, focusing on sort of that in between as well. And when something doesn't feel right, even in a virtual space, to address it and to say, I'm sensing, there's some tension here, and is anyone else feeling it? Or, to really look at addressing it in a way that is kind, truthful, and compassionate.
It's really interesting, it just responding to what you just said, it almost feels as if there's a bit of a paradox going on here. So on the one hand, we are very disconnected. We're in this almost like a inhuman, virtually mediated space, but it's calling us to bring all of our very human skills to bear, like curiosity and imagination and empathy and, those things that we don't need. I think when we're physically in an environment, we can get away without those things. But when in this environment, it's almost inviting us to bring our full humanity, to be able to function in this space.
Absolutely. I don't know about you, but I feel like when holding a space or running a workshop, even if it's just a process accompaniment and holding the space, basically, it's so much more draining because you have to be so present, and being in touch with your own intuitive sense of what's going on, but also being there in terms of the group, and it's very different.
I think Pascal's question is touching this a little bit as well, because he's missing the spontaneous discussions in the corridors or around a coffee machine or whatever. So do you have any substitute that could somehow work in the current situation of being remotely? Because I think a lot of us miss out on talking, chit-chatting with each other also now remotely.
I don't know all of the new tools out there, but this is the one thing that I haven't really seen an effective substitute for. I'm not sure about you, Michèle. I think this is, it's because you typically when you have these serendipitous, spontaneous corridor discussions, it wasn't necessarily with somebody on your team. It was just somebody in the same building that you ran into. And to simulate that, I think is really difficult. So I don't know. That is the one thing. I don't know if you've come across anything, Michèle, that simulates that.
Tools, no. I mean, I think
Slack.
What works really well is, I mean, if there's this is something that we recently tried with one of the clients, is they really wanted to have a full day together. They wanted to be in a physical space, but they couldn't. With the regulations, they just couldn't. So they decided we'll be on Zoom full day. And I was thinking, oh my word, this is going to be so draining. But literally, they created all the virtual spaces and very intentionally put together spaces for particular things. And then there was a space to just connect and have coffee. And whoever was there was literally grabbing a cup of coffee and having a chat. And I know that, I mean, we also have this in our organization, is to have sort of those types of spaces, but it felt natural in a way because everyone had committed to this workshop. And then when they did have sort of a coffee break, they were walking around in the garden and chit-chatting and having other conversations. And so that was kind of a great substitute, and it worked well. And I could also pop in and have a coffee and chat to people there. But it was because they committed to the 8 hours and kind of had that space with obviously other good breaks in between. But sort of the coffee corridor conversations that used to happen in the office, I don't know, I would say I've substituted it with other great in-person conversations and going out to potentially walk and talk and have like dialogue walks, for example, or doing other things. And I think there was a comment previously that nothing can really replace that, but to make sure that we do that, right? So we do stop and go and have those conversations with someone that would inspire us around a particular topic at work potentially. And I mean, we are focusing on work here. So I think it would be to find sparring partners that one can have those meetups with. And I'm talking about physical meetups because I think that it's something that everyone is intentionally doing anyway.
I think, and I see Rita just put something in the comment around using knowledge cafes for this. I think maybe the takeaway from this is it's not going to happen completely by accident. You need to now really be intentional about creating spaces where it might happen. You know, inviting people from different parts of the organization into some of these processes. It's you know, the kind of completely serendipitous aspect of it, I think, is it only really is enabled when we're, you know, in a physical space together. I saw Mario, you had your hand up a while back. I don't know if you wanted to ask a question, be unmuted, or is that in the chat?
It might be in the chat or also in the Q&A.
So was it Mario? No, it was someone else that...
I just saw a hand up, but I see there's a question around 80-20 split of investment in tech versus people investment. And he thinks it should be 20-80 for the sustained transition. He also had a question of the new next or the next version of capitalism or economic models.
Times we're living in.
I mean, there are interesting ones out there, you know, like donut economics and all of these. I think the next is still emerging. I don't know if we've really landed on what it looks like yet. And you know, I think there's, you know, I've just been reflecting on people who need to make decisions. You know, I've got so much empathy for leaders of countries, some at least, leaders of large organizations, and the kind of decisions that they need to make now, you know, with all of the uncertainty. I don't know if I would flip 80-20 to 20-80. You know, I think I'll give you my favorite answer in complexity. It depends, you know, it's so context specific. So I don't know. I think in some contexts, yes. You know, I think there's also a really big difference between what this would look like in a country, for example, like, you know, Denmark or Sweden versus what it looks like in South Africa. You know, so I don't know that there's a single answer to that question. But I do think that we need to find a balance between, you know, in some companies, there's an over focus on individuals and people who need to change their behavior. And, you know, there's a very strong focus on behavior change. And then in other companies, there's a really strong focus on investing in technology and technology change, etc. And I think there is a need for we need to think of both. It's not only about the individual, it's about the context as well. And it's not only about the context, it's about the people. So it's this both and.
That was a good answer, I think. I think we would have time for one more question. If anyone has anything still that they would like to ask, you can just pop the last question. Otherwise, I've been also putting some links for you guys in the chat, so you can follow us on LinkedIn to keep up to speed on the recording of this webinar and other interesting things. You can join our community where you can continue to speak with our Agile coaches also on topics that you want to have help with. You can read the blogs, you can look at the previous webinars that's been mentioned also here today, all from the links. So I strongly recommend you to do that. And if you have any questions, you can also reach out to both Michèle and Sonja, probably easiest through LinkedIn, or if you want to also just get in touch with us, you can send us an email and we will link you with Michèle and Sonja if you have more questions.
Cool. So there's one last question.
There is one more, yeah. Do you want to?
Do you want to do this one? How is the link between the personality type of the leaders versus the human factor taken into consideration or not?
I don't know if it's about the personality type necessarily, but I do think what does play into this is the leader's attitude and thinking about the need to control, being comfortable with uncertainty, being in ambiguity and change. I think if it's a leader who really values being in control, then that just, it permeates. It creates all kinds of interesting dynamics. That's not necessarily positive. So I don't know if it's a personality type, or if it's, I think many leaders have been taught in MBA processes and all kinds of things, that good leaders have answers, they're in control, so there's a particular kind of style of leadership that I think people have been taught and that we're shifting away from now, but it has a big impact on people and how they experience these things.
I agree. And I feel there are so many different personality profiling tools out there, and whether it's Myers-Briggs, Clarity 4D, whatever you like, whichever flavor you like, I think they are both useful and limiting, and they're an entry to a conversation and an exploration around, what is my dominant way of being, and that's useful in this context. However, there may be other areas that I want to explore, and how could I start looking at expanding on that learning edge and getting into a different space as well. And as you were speaking about it, Sonja, the being comfortable with uncertainty, and that's a big thing. And I think we can definitely talk more about that, perhaps in another webinar.
There is going to be an upcoming webinar also next month. There's going to be more info about this a little bit later on, so stay also tuned for that. But for sure, this topic has a lot to talk about, so it's difficult to fit everything into one hour discussion. But it's been very, very interesting to take part of your discussion and listen to your thinking in this great topic. So
thanks to all the participants, and thanks for the questions. That was a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, and thanks for holding the space and handling all the comments and things, Sophia. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. It's my pleasure. It was really nice to have everyone here, and we really hope to see you also next month. And big thanks to Sonja for your time, and for Michèle also your time, and hope to see you all soon again. Have a nice, not weekend probably yet, but end to the week, right? Have a nice Wednesday, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.